Karen trespassed into my yard, so I leased it to a shooting Rangicaron Martinez thought she owned the entire neighborhood. For months, she'd been cutting through my backyard like it was her personal highway, ignoring my fence, my signs, and my requests to stop. She'd file HOA complaints whenever I dared to question her. But what Karen didn't know was that I wasn't just some pushover homeowner she could bully. I had options she never saw coming. And when she pushed me too far, I gave her neighbors something they'd never forget. My name is Jake Chen, and 3 years ago I thought I'd found paradise in Willowbrook Estates. As a 34-year-old software engineer, I'd saved up enough to buy my dream home, a beautiful house sitting on 2 acres of prime corner property. Most lots in the subdivision were tiny postage stamps, but mine was different. Mature oak trees provided natural shade, a small creek ran along the back boundary, and I had enough space for my workshop, gardens, and weekend motorcycle restoration projects. What made this property truly special wasn't just the space, it was the location. My lot bordered 15 acres of undeveloped county land that I'd quietly purchased as an investment 3 months before moving in. My previous job as a county planning consultant had taught me to recognize opportunity when I saw it. The land was zoned rural commercial, grandfathered from the area's farming days, and it opened up possibilities that most suburban homeowners could never imagine. I'd chosen Willowbrook specifically to escape city noise and create a peaceful retreat. I installed a 6-foot privacy fence, planted vegetable gardens, and built a small workshop where I could restore vintage motorcycles on weekends. The HOA seemed reasonable during the buying process, standard rules about lawn maintenance and house colors. Nothing that would interfere with quiet suburban life, but my peace ended the day Karen Martinez moved in next door. Karen was a 48-year-old real estate agent who'd recently been elected to the HOA board. She had strong opinions about everything from mailbox placement to acceptable garden plants. Within her first week in the neighborhood, she began treating my 2-acre lot like an extension of her own property. It started small. Karen would cut across the corner of my yard while walking her designer poodle, Duchess. When I politely mentioned she should use the sidewalk, Karen laughed it off. "It's just a few steps," she said with a dismissive wave. Neighbors should be flexible with each other, but those few steps became a daily routine, then twice daily. Then, whenever Karen felt like taking the shortcut to the mailbox cluster or community pool, the trespassing escalated when Karen decided my oak trees created too much shade for her prized rose garden. She began trimming branches that hung over our shared fence line, which was technically legal. But then she started crossing onto my property to clean up the mess she'd created. I'd come home to find Karen 20 feet into my yard, pruning and rearranging my landscaping like she was the neighborhood gardening committee. I tried handling things diplomatically. I installed clear private property signs along the fence line and had several polite conversations with Karen about respecting boundaries. Each time, she dismissed my concerns with excuses about maintaining neighborhood aesthetics or suggestions that I was being unreasonably territorial. For such a large lot, the final straw came when I discovered Karen had been hosting her weekly coffee group on my back patio while I was at work. My Ring doorbell camera showed for women setting up folding chairs and tables, spreading out pastries and coffee thermoses, and spending over 2 hours discussing neighborhood gossip and HOA business on my private property. When I confronted Karen about this outrageous violation, her response made my blood boil. "You're never home during the day anyway," she said with a shrug. "We always clean up after ourselves. What's the big deal?" That's when I realized Karen didn't see me as a neighbor deserving basic respect. She saw me as some young pushover who would tolerate anything to avoid conflict. She assumed I'd eventually give up and let her do whatever she wanted on my property, but Karen had made a crucial miscalculation. She had no idea she was messing with someone who had both the resources and the legal authority to make her regret every single trespassing step. My hidden commercial property was about to become the biggest surprise of her HOA career. What Karen didn't know was that her months of harassment had already pushed me past the breaking point. I'd been researching my options, consulting with lawyers, and making plans. Karen thought she was dealing with just another suburban homeowner who would eventually fold under pressure. She was about to discover how wrong she could be. Karen Martinez didn't just trespass on my property. She turned the entire HOA into her personal weapon against me the moment I dared to challenge her behavior. The first official complaint arrived exactly 3 days after I told Karen to stop hosting coffee meetings on my patio. The certified letter claimed my motorcycle workshop violated HOA covenants regarding commercial activities and noise disturbances during unreasonable hours. According to the complaint, multiple neighbors had reported excessive mechanical noise that disrupted the peaceful residential character of Willowbrook Estates. I read that complaint with growing fury. I'd been restoring vintage motorcycles in my garage for over 2 years without a single neighbor complaint. My work hours were strictly limited to weekday evenings after 6 o'clock and Saturday afternoons, well within all community noise ordinances. More importantly, motorcycle restoration was obviously a hobby, not a commercial business. I wasn't running a repair shop or selling bikes for profit. The complaint was clearly retaliation for challenging Karen's trespassing, and we both knew it. But Karen was just getting started with her harassment campaign. The second complaint arrived 2 weeks later, targeting my excessive outdoor storage. The HOA demanded I remove my unsightly storage structure within 30 days or face escalating daily fines. They were referring to a small metal shed where I kept lawn equipment and motorcycle parts. I pulled out my original architectural plans, proving the shed was properly permitted and met all required setbacks from property lines. The HOA ignored my documentation, claiming the shed's metal siding didn't match the aesthetic standards established by surrounding homes. Karen's masterpiece complaint came in early October, unauthorized agricultural use of residential property. She had somehow convinced the HOA board that my vegetable garden and 3 fruit trees constituted a violation of covenants restricting commercial farming activities. The complaint included photographs taken from multiple angles around my property, clearly shot during Karen's unauthorized visits to my backyard. The irony was absolutely infuriating. Karen was literally trespassing on my property to document supposed violations she could report to the HOA. She'd walk through my yard with her smartphone, photographing anything she could twist into a covenant breach, then file official complaints from the comfort of her stolen coffee sessions on my patio. Each complaint triggered an identical bureaucratic nightmare: certified mail delivery, mandatory written responses within 10 business days, and threats of escalating fines if violations weren't corrected immediately. I found myself spending entire weekends researching HOA law, photographing my own property for evidence, and drafting detailed legal responses to frivolous accusations. The psychological warfare was exhausting and expensive, exactly what Karen intended. She wasn't trying to win these individual complaints. She was trying to bury me in paperwork, legal fees, and constant stress until I finally gave up and moved away. The harassment reached peak absurdity when Karen reported my unauthorized fence modifications. My supposed violation: installing a simple gate latch on my existing privacy fence so I could access my backyard without walking around the entire house. The HOA demanded detailed architectural drawings for a basic hardware store latch that was completely invisible from any public area. But Karen's most dangerous strategy was building an official paper trail that painted me as a chronic rule violator. Every frivolous complaint created documentation in my HOA file. Every response I submitted was characterized as defensive or uncooperative. Karen was systematically constructing a narrative where she appeared to be a concerned community advocate trying to help a problem Neighbor, comply with reasonable standards. The final insult came when I received a formal complaint about my hostile and threatening demeanor during neighborhood interactions. Karen claimed I'd been verbally aggressive and intimidating when she attempted to resolve violations through friendly discussion. She described herself as a patient neighbor, repeatedly trying to help me understand community expectations, while portraying me as an unreasonable troublemaker who responded to helpful suggestions with anger and threats. I knew exactly what Karen was doing. She was manufacturing evidence that would justify more serious HOA penalties down the road. Every complaint she filed supported her version of events well, making me appear increasingly problematic to other board members and neighbors who only heard her side of the story. Karen's strategy was brilliant in its calculated cruelty. She'd created a paper trail showing months of supposed violations and uncooperative behavior. If I fought back too aggressively, I'd look like the hostile neighbor she'd already painted me to be. If I didn't fight back, she'd continue escalating until I was fined out of the neighborhood entirely. But Karen had made one critical miscalculation in her systematic harassment campaign. She assumed I was just another suburban homeowner who would eventually surrender rather than endure the constant stress and expense of fighting frivolous complaints. She thought I'd eventually put my house on the market and disappear, leaving her free to treat my former property however she pleased. What Karen didn't realize was that her target had resources, patience, and legal options that could turn her petty tyranny into the most expensive mistake of her entire life. The war was just beginning, and Karen had no idea who she was really fighting. Karen Martinez's random complaints evolved into something much more dangerous, a systematic campaign designed to force me out of Willowbrook Estates. Entirely. Everything changed when Karen got herself elected HOA president during a poorly attended annual meeting in January. With 3 close allies now controlling the 5-member board, she had the votes needed to transform her personal vendetta against me into official community policy. I watched in growing horror as monthly board meetings became Karen's platform for targeting my property with increasingly creative interpretations of established covenants. Karen's first presidential act was implementing what she called enhanced compliance monitoring for properties with established violation histories. Since Karen herself had manufactured my violation history through months of frivolous complaints, I became the pilot program's only target. This new policy meant monthly inspections of my property, photographed documentation of any potential concerns, and automatic fines for issues that would normally receive warning notices first. The monthly inspections were pure performance art designed to humiliate me in front of the entire neighborhood. Karen would arrive with an official clipboard, measuring tape, and professional camera, treating my property like she was investigating a crime scene. She'd photograph my garbage cans if they were visible from the street, even 15 minutes before scheduled pickup time. She'd measure grass height in dozens of locations across my lawn, desperately searching for patches that might exceed the covenant's 3-inch maximum by even a 1/4 inch. Karen documented everything with obsessive detail. The exact position of my motorcycle in the driveway became a violation if it wasn't perfectly centered between the painted lines. Garden hoses had to be wound on approved hangers, not simply coiled on the ground. Even my mailbox became a source of fines when Karen decided its bronze finish had faded beyond acceptable community standards and required immediate replacement. Each monthly inspection generated an official report submitted to the full HOA board and distributed to all homeowners as compliance education materials. Karen was systematically turning me into the neighborhood's official example of what not to do, creating documentation that made me appear to be in constant violation of basic community standards. But Karen's cruelest innovation was something she called the community aesthetics assessment, a special monthly fee charged to homeowners whose properties supposedly required additional oversight to maintain neighborhood standards. I was the only resident subjected to this $75 monthly penalty, justified by my established pattern of covenant violations and ongoing resistance to community feedback. The fee was pure extortion disguised as legitimate policy, but Karen's board allies rubber-stamped it without question. I was literally being charged extra money every month for the privilege of being harassed by my own homeowners association. The psychological torture intensified when Karen began organizing neighborhood improvement workshops in my backyard without my permission or knowledge. She'd schedule these events during my work hours, sending official HOA notifications to all residents about meetings to discuss property maintenance standards and landscaping best practices. Neighbors would show up expecting a legitimate community event, only to discover they were trespassing on private property that Karen had no authority to use for HOA business. I'd come home from work to find 20 people trampling through my gardens, examining my shed, and discussing my property's supposed deficiencies like I wasn't standing right there. When I politely asked everyone to leave my private property, Karen would loudly explain that the HOA had established inspection and education rights for properties under enhanced monitoring, making me appear unreasonable for not understanding basic community procedures. The social isolation was devastating and obviously intentional. Karen's relentless campaign had successfully branded me as the neighborhood problem resident, the guy who couldn't follow simple rules and became hostile when neighbors tried to help him comply with reasonable standards. Other homeowners began actively avoiding me, afraid they might become Karen's next target if they appeared too friendly with the community troublemaker. Karen's masterpiece of bureaucratic harassment was convincing the board to initiate involuntary architectural review of my entire property. This process required me to submit detailed plans and professional photographs of every single outdoor element, from individual plant varieties to exterior light fixture specifications, for approval by an architectural committee personally chaired by Karen herself. The review process was designed to be impossible to complete successfully. Karen would reject my submissions for microscopic technical deficiencies, demand complete resubmissions with additional professional documentation, and impose strict deadlines that always seemed to coincide with my business travel schedule. Every missed deadline generated automatic fines, and every resubmission required additional fees for administrative processing costs. After 8 months of this systematic harassment, I finally understood Karen's ultimate strategy. She wasn't just trying to annoy me or collect fine money. She was trying to force me to sell my house and leave Willowbrook Estates entirely. The constant fines, fees, and bureaucratic warfare had already cost me thousands of dollars and hundreds of hours of my personal time. Karen was betting I'd eventually decide the fight wasn't worth the stress and put my property on the market just to escape her tyranny, but Karen had fatally underestimated her target. She thought she was systematically destroying some ordinary suburban homeowner who would eventually fold under sustained pressure. What she didn't know was that her escalating harassment campaign had just triggered the activation of resources and legal rights that would turn her position of power into the biggest liability of her entire life. While Karen Martinez spent months photographing my yard and filing complaints, she never bothered to research the most important detail about my property, and that oversight was about to cost her everything. Karen assumed she knew everything about my 2-acre lot because she could see it from her kitchen window, but public property records would have revealed something that would have changed her entire approach to our conflict. 3 months before Karen even moved to Willowbrook Estates, I had quietly purchased the 15-acre undeveloped tract that bordered the entire back section of our subdivision. My land acquisition wasn't random real estate speculation. It was a strategic investment based on insider knowledge from my previous career as a county planning consultant. I understood zoning classifications, development restrictions, and most importantly, the specific use categories that certain properties could legally support. What appeared to be empty woodland to casual observers was actually prime commercial property with some very interesting legal possibilities. The 15 acres were zoned rural commercial, a classification grandfathered from the area's agricultural past that had never been updated despite surrounding residential development. This zoning allowed agricultural use, light manufacturing, recreational facilities, educational centers, and most relevant to my current situation with Karen, outdoor sporting venues and training facilities. The county had deliberately maintained the rural commercial designation because it generated significant tax revenue without requiring expensive municipal services like sewer connections or street maintenance. Local officials saw no benefit in rezoning the property to match surrounding residential areas, especially since any development would need to meet strict environmental and safety standards regardless of permitted use categories. I'd originally planned to hold the land as a long-term investment, maybe eventually building a larger workshop or small manufacturing facility for a side business. But Karen's escalating harassment had sparked a much more creative idea for utilizing my property rights. The inspiration came during one of Karen's monthly compliance inspections when she made the mistake of loudly threatening me within earshot of my neighbor, retired Marine Corps Colonel Bill Thompson. Bill had been quietly observing Karen's systematic harassment campaign with growing disgust, and he pulled me aside afterward to offer some military wisdom. Son, the best way to handle a bully is making them realize they picked the wrong target. That conversation prompted me to research exactly what activities my rural commercial zoning would legally permit. The possibilities were fascinating and far more extensive than I'd initially realized. Outdoor recreation facilities, sporting venues, training academies, and educational facilities were all explicitly allowed uses with proper permitting and safety measures. The perfect solution emerged when I remembered my college roommate Marcus Rivera, who owned a mobile tactical training company providing firearms instruction and defensive shooting courses for law enforcement agencies and civilian customers. Marcus had been struggling for years to find permanent range facilities due to residential opposition and restrictive zoning in most suburban areas. He'd been operating from temporary locations, constantly searching for property where he could establish a professional outdoor shooting range. My 15 acres were absolutely perfect for Marcus's needs. The property was properly zoned, completely isolated from residential areas, and large enough to accommodate multiple shooting bays with extensive safety buffers. The natural topography even provided ideal backstops and noise barriers that would contain all range activities. Within the property boundaries, Marcus and I spent weeks developing plans for a world-class tactical training facility that would be completely legal and impossible for any HOA to challenge. We researched safety protocols, environmental regulations, and permit requirements. Every aspect of our planned facility would exceed county standards and industry best practices, but the most beautiful irony was something Karen would never see coming until it was too late. My residential property sat directly between Willowbrook Estates and my commercial land. Every access road to the shooting range would necessarily run right past Karen's backyard. The customer parking area would be clearly visible from her kitchen window. Weekend training sessions would bring a steady stream of pickup trucks carrying firearms enthusiasts to their new favorite facility. Karen thought her systematic harassment was driving me towards surrender and eventual departure from the neighborhood. She had no idea that her campaign of HOA tyranny was actually pushing me toward a legal response that would permanently transform her quiet suburban paradise into ground zero for the busiest tactical shooting range in the entire county. The permits were already approved. The safety inspections were scheduled. Marcus had lined up law enforcement contracts and civilian training programs. Everything was ready for implementation. We were just waiting for the right moment to spring our. Surprise! Karen Martinez thought she was systematically destroying some powerless suburban homeowner through HOA politics and bureaucratic warfare. She was about to discover that she'd been trespassing on the property of someone who could legally turn her dream home into a daily reminder of the most expensive mistake of her entire life. I had spent 3 months meticulously planning my response to Karen's harassment, but execution day arrived with absolutely perfect timing. The same Saturday morning, Karen had scheduled another unauthorized neighborhood improvement workshop on my back patio. From my kitchen window, I watched Karen methodically setting up folding tables and chairs on my property, preparing for her 10 o'clock presentation on maintaining community property values through collective standards. She'd sent official HOA invitations to 18 neighbors, listing my home address as the meeting location without bothering to mention she had no legal authority to use my private property for association business. Today would mark Karen's final trespassing violation, and she had no idea she was about to receive a front-row demonstration of exactly why you should never harass someone without understanding what resources they control. At precisely 9:15, the first convoy rolled up my driveway. 3 diesel pickup trucks pulling commercial trailers turned into my property, followed by a mobile command vehicle sporting Precision Defense Training Academy logos and professional graphics advertising firearms instruction services. Uniformed range safety officers began systematically unloading portable shooting barriers, surveying equipment, and industrial safety installations, while Karen's workshop attendees watched in growing confusion from my backyard. Marcus Rivera, my business partner and certified tactical firearms instructor, directed the operation with impressive military precision. His experienced team quickly established a temporary registration center in my driveway, complete with folding tables displaying safety equipment, training materials, and large banners reading Grand Opening Weekend, Willowbrook Tactical Training Range. Karen abandoned her workshop setup and stormed toward my front door, pounding frantically while her invited guests began hurriedly collecting their notebooks and coffee thermoses. "What the hell is this supposed to be?" she demanded when I calmly opened the door. "You cannot operate a shooting range in a residential neighborhood. This violates every HOA covenant and county zoning restriction." I handed Karen a thick manila folder containing permits, zoning documentation, environmental impact studies, and business operation licenses. "Actually, Karen, I absolutely can operate this facility," I explained with a smile. "The tactical training range isn't located in any residential neighborhood. It's situated on my properly zoned commercial property that happens to border this subdivision. Everything has been completely legal and professionally permitted for months. County safety inspectors provided final approval just last Tuesday." Karen's face drained of color as she frantically flipped through page after page of authentic documentation. The permits bore official county seals, the zoning maps clearly delineated my commercial property boundaries, and every required signature was properly notarized and legitimate. I had methodically satisfied every legal requirement and regulatory standard. There was absolutely nothing Karen, the HOA board, or any county authority could do to prevent this operation, but this will completely destroy neighborhood property values. Karen sputtered desperately. The noise pollution, the constant traffic. I tried very hard to be a reasonable neighbor for over a year. I replied calmly but firmly. "I asked you politely dozens of times to stop trespassing on my private property." I responded professionally to every single frivolous HOA complaint you manufactured. I paid thousands of dollars in bogus fines and harassment fees just to maintain neighborhood peace. But you chose to turn my life into an expensive nightmare through systematic harassment and bureaucratic warfare. Now I'm providing you and your neighbors with a much more interesting view from your backyard windows, as if perfectly choreographed. Marcus's amplified voice echoed across both properties, ladies and gentlemen. Our first comprehensive safety briefing begins in exactly 20 minutes. All registered participants please gather immediately at the equipment tables for range orientation, safety protocol review, and personal protective equipment distribution. The timing couldn't have been more perfect or humiliating for Karan. I had deliberately scheduled the range's grand opening weekend to coincide precisely with her unauthorized workshop, ensuring maximum neighborhood visibility and Karan's complete public embarrassment. Instead of discussing abstract community standards, her neighbors were now receiving detailed education about weekend firearms training schedules, corporate team building programs, and recreational shooting league opportunities. Marcus's professional team continued their efficient setup with impressive coordination. They established clearly marked customer parking areas, POSTED large permanent signs advertising evening training sessions and weekend tactical courses, and installed professional safety barriers that completely blocked any direct view of shooting activities while making the operation's substantial scope obvious to every neighbor. I had even arranged for the county newspaper's business development reporter to document our grand opening weekend. Photographs of enthusiastic range customers and detailed quotes about bringing professional tactical training services to underserved suburban markets would appear in Thursday's business section, creating permanent public documentation of Karen's neighborhood transformation. The psychological impact on Karen was immediate and absolutely devastating. Her carefully constructed public image as the neighborhood's dedicated protector of residential property values crumbled completely as she watched her own backyard become the primary staging area for exactly the kind of intensive commercial activity that homeowners associations exist specifically to prevent. Karen Martinez realized she hadn't simply lost her personal war against me, she had accidentally triggered the creation of a permanent operational nightmare that would make her dream retirement home completely unlivable for years to come. And thanks to her months of systematic legal harassment, there wasn't a single thing she could legally do to stop it. The Willowbrook Tactical Range's grand opening weekend triggered a neighborhood crisis that exposed Karen Martinez's harassment campaign to the entire community, and the consequences for Karen were swift, brutal, and permanent. Within 2 hours of the first controlled gunfire echoing across our subdivision, Karen's cell phone began exploding with furious calls from neighbors demanding immediate explanations. These weren't my supporters calling to congratulate me. They were the exact same residents who had received Karen's monthly violation reports, attended her compliance workshops, and supported her enhanced monitoring policies. Now they suddenly realized that Karen's year-long community protection campaign had directly